So welcome to HEDG Hosts, a series of events run by the Historical Economics and Development Group at the University of Southern Denmark, where we invite some of the most incisive writers and thinkers inside and outside academia to present their work and demonstrate the relevance and continued impact of historical developments on contemporary societies. Today, it is a pleasure to welcome Clara Mattei, Assistant Professor in the Economics Department of the New School for Social Research. Her research contributes to the history of capitalism, exploring the critical relation between economic ideas and technocratic policy making. Today, she will give a talk about her book, The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism, which, for those of you based in Odense, is available for purchase at the campus bookstore Academic Books. It has won widespread praise and was named the Financial Times' Best Book of the Year. A few practical details before we let her get started with the presentation. Because this is being recorded, then do not ask any questions during the presentation. There'll be time for that at the end of the presentation. So we'll just let Clara talk, and then we'll have questions at the end. Okay, over to you, Clara.
Many thanks for having me here with you. I will not show slides. I will talk about the book, and yes, and I hope we have an interesting conversation after. So the Capital Order is an exercise, which I have right here, is an exercise in historical political economy. And it uses the reconstruction of dynamics and processes that occurred 100 years ago, immediately after the First World War, to speak to us about the present, to give us a lens to critically look at what is going on around us. And it's interesting to note how timely the conversation is, because austerity is back with a vengeance. Austerity has greatly informed most countries around the globe for at least the past 50 years. But in this current moment, we are experiencing, and again, I'm not exactly sure what is happening specifically in Denmark, but I can speak about what is happening in the United States, in Great Britain, and in Italy, for example, where we're seeing a massive resurgence of austerity. In what form? Well, first of all, in the hikes of interest rates that we know since March, the main central banks around the globe have been increasing interest rates. Together with cuts in social expenditures, regressive taxation, and attacks on organized labor. Just in the United States, last month, the United States government passed legislation to block the strikes of the railway workers and oblige them to accept a contract in which they basically had to forego their demands for better sick leave. Apologies. So to understand the current state of affairs and why austerity is so resilient, the idea is that we have to repoliticize austerity. The book was written with the idea to go beyond the technical debate that usually surrounds austerity between economists, between is austerity good or bad? Is austerity expansionary or actually causing a downturn? And the idea here is to think about austerity in terms of class analysis and see how one cannot really dismiss austerity as being pure irrational economic policy, as done often by many Keynesian economists, and understand that actually austerity has a fundamental purpose. It is actually in the DNA of the very functioning of our capitalist economy. The Capital Order, the title, the main thesis is that in order for economic growth under capitalism to happen, the precondition is capital order as a social relation. So economic growth, capital, as money invested to make more money, requires capital as this fundamental acceptance of the majority to live in condition of exploited wage work. So the idea here is that austerity is a crucial tool to stabilize class relation, even at the expense of destabilizing the economy momentarily through a recession, it guarantees what is much more fundamental in the long run for capitalist societies to protect themselves against possibilities of social change. So I will tell you the story that I analyze, what happened after the First World War, and then we will get back again to the present to see how we can make sense of what is happening today, especially how we can make sense of the fact that Fed officials and other experts at the head of the leading economic institutions willingly are inducing an economic recession. And once more, I think we will find out that this is understandable if we look at the fact that there's a lot of labor turmoil in this historical moment. There's massive strikes being actually ignited by inflation. There is a moment in which the workforce is actually in a moment of strength because of the phenomenon of the Great Resignation. People are not going back to work. There is a tight labor market. And thus, experts need to solve the problem of a tight labor market by cooling down the economy, which will ultimately increase unemployment and create a situation by which people will have to accept to go back to work at lower wages and in precarious conditions. So, the capital order is divided fundamentally in two parts. The first part of the book reconstructs the major existential crisis that capitalism underwent after the First World War. The book begins by telling the story of the massive shock that the Great War caused in the economy. For the first time in the history of capitalism, laissez-faire was questioned. War collectivism was implemented. The state became the main employer and the main producer. And the work is done by analyzing. The whole book is a constant parallelism between the United States and Italy. And I will say more why I chose this parallelism, but what's interesting is that you see that in both countries, as in all other belligerent countries, this breaking down of the previously sacred confines of the market repoliticizes the pillars of our economic system. Wage relations and private property of the means of production are no longer understood by the general public as natural givens, but rather it becomes obvious that wage relations and private property of the means of production are maintained through explicit political choice from the part of the states, the bureaucrats, and the private elite. Thus, chapters 2, 3, and 4 of this book get into all the plurality of experiments that were concretely put into place in the so-called Red Biennium, 1918 to 1920, especially 1919, 1920, of alternatives to production and distribution that would overcome capitalist practices, overcome wage relations and private property of the means of production. The ambition, the way I undertook the study was to give voice to the spirit of the time, to avoid the benefit of hindsight of saying everything failed. Right now, we could say it didn't work, but actually at the time in 1919, from the bourgeoisie to the radical militant workers, no one thought capitalism was going to last for more than a couple of years. So this widespread sentiment of the end of society as it stood until that moment. And so I look at, sorry, I wanted to read you. I wanted to read you the quote of John Maynard Keynes, if I can find it. of course, I can't find it, so sorry. Anyway, the point is that at that time, inflation was clearly understood as being a political problem primarily, rather than just an economic problem, as it is still today. And Keynes was very much terrified about the fall of the bourgeois social contract, because inflationism was triggering at the whole basis of contract and of the capitalist system generally. This is actually his wording. So I look at the variety of exercises from the more reformist that put political priorities before economic priorities. For example, very sophisticated understanding of emancipating workers through adult education, through communal housing that would allow women to actually have time off during vacation, to the birth of the welfare state. Two more radical cases, such as the Sankey Committee in Great Britain, which was all about nationalizing the main industry of coal, and workers' management. My favorite experiment that I look at in detail is the worker council movement that was very big in Italy with l'Ordine Nuovo of Antonio Gramsci, which not only provided new institutional possibilities through these councils that were based on horizontal participation in the workplace and were the nucleus of a new state, which was not alienated from the people, but actually expressing a society made of producers that would overcome class antagonism. L'Ordine Nuovo of Gramsci was also a methodological debunking of bourgeois economic theory. So it was about gaining back the agency of the worker through the idea that the worker was the center of economic production, and thus the need to base our society on economic democracy for any type of actual political democracy to be even possible. So I can't get into the detail, but there is a variety of experiments that I think are very insightful for today. I know Professor Sharp works on cooperative movement. There was also a big experiment in cooperatives in Italy, in guild socialism in Great Britain that was very successful. Alternatives emerging. Well, in this scenario of really questioning the foundations of our society, of course, reaction happened, and it happened swiftly. So the second part of the book, which is where the biggest contribution of the research lies, is about reconstructing austerity as this intelligent counteroffensive, which was launched by the international elite, by bureaucrats and experts that participated for the first time in the international financial conferences of Brussels in 1920 and Genoa in 1922. And they created this novel financial code, which was made up of what I describe as the austerity trinity. So the contribution of the capital order is to rethink austerity, not just as something that has to do with budget cuts, but something much deeper and more complex. So this austerity trinity is codified at these international financial conferences. And what is this trinity? Well, it speaks again to what's happening now. So we have fiscal austerity, which is about how the state spends, and it's about spend not in the aggregate. You can't just look at how much the state spends in the aggregate, because in the United States, for example, right now, a lot of money, they just passed $850 million to send to Ukraine. A lot of money is being spent. So you can't, but you need to look at where the money is being spent. And what you see is that austerity is all about shifting resources away from the people towards a select few. So it's about cutting social expenditures, cutting benefits, unemployment benefits, housing benefits, schooling benefits, whatever. So major cuts in social expenditures accompanied by regressive taxation. What is regressive taxation? Well, it's about taxing the rich less than taxing the poor. So it's about cutting all corporate taxes, high income brackets. and increasing instead consumption taxes, something that again has been kind of the go-to policies still today. This fiscal austerity goes hand in hand with monetary austerity, which is about increasing interest rates, making money more expensive. What happens if it gets more expensive to borrow? Well, not only common people living on credit have to tighten their belts, it's also the case that it becomes less profitable to invest. And this creates a downturn, which ultimately increases unemployment. So what you see after the First World War is that this was a very important way of silencing the workforce, was actually inducing this economic depression. And finally, industrial austerity. Industrial austerity is about privatization, is about direct wage repression, labor deregulation. All of this trinity was thought about in very explicit terms with a rhetoric that it sounds very familiar to us today, which was all about citizens have lived beyond their needs. Citizens have lived beyond their means. And now it's the time to all make collective sacrifice. The motto coined at the International Financial Conference was consume less, produce more. And this motto of austerity found real application throughout the globe at that moment. I focus on Italy and Britain. And what you see is that austerity was extremely successful in foreclosing all these alternatives that had emerged after the First World War. So the parallelism between Italy and Britain is for me extremely important. Why? Well, because a thought-provoking message of the capital order is that if you focus on austerity, what you see is that these comforting binaries between liberal parliamentary democracies and the emergence of fascist dictatorship have much more in common than one would think. So we had on the one side the cradle of capitalism, the cradle of liberal parliamentary democracy, Great Britain, the advanced country and empire. And on the other hand, we had Italy, in which Benito Mussolini took power in 1922, called by the king, by the way. And Mussolini played a very important role in pacifying class conflict in Italy because he was the best student of austerity. So if you take these two countries, I look at in both countries how austerity was implemented. And what you see is that in Britain, what happened was that it primarily was the impersonal laws of the market, which trapped the workers into this economic compulsion that forced them back into accepting their conditions as wage workers, given that unemployment soared to 17% of the insured workforce in just 1 year after the interest rate had gone up to 7% in 1920. And here I would like to read you a quote from G.D.H. Cole, who at the time was a guild socialist, public intellectual, observing what was happening. And he was one of the ones who had betted on the end of capitalism within a few years. And in by the mid-1920s, he was writing, the big working class offensive had been successfully stalled off. And British capitalism, though threatened with economic adversity, felt itself once more safely in the saddle and well able to cope, both industrially and politically, with any attempt that might still be made from the labor side to unseat it. So we clearly see how G.D.H. Cole points the finger to the fact that the economic downturn was a short-term cost for a structural gain, which was class stability, and thus the possibility of wage relations to be reestablished. In Italy, this economic coercion took a more personal note with the direct intervention, more explicit direct intervention of the fascist state, which politically repressed any opposition to austerity and to the emergence of this new fascist austere order. The fascist state actually intervened, repressing wages by decree. So while in Britain, wages were repressed through these impersonal laws of the market, in Italy, it was done through law, with making strikes illegal, banning unions as out of the fascist one, and of course, torturing and jailing any opposition. However, it's interesting to note how the type of treatment that ultimately Italians and British citizens had to go through in the 1920s was stunningly similar. And this I show also through data in chapter 9 of the Capital Order. And you also see how a very important role, and this is the other focus that is very important for the book, was played by economic experts, by the emerging new economic paradigm, the new classical framework. The marginalist turn happened at the end of the 1800s, and this paradigm of pure economics was diffusing in those years. So Mussolini was capable of implementing austerity because of the widespread support and active participation of professors of economics of this novel economic paradigm, which is the same one that is still dominant today. So the so-called mainstream neoclassical framework has its origins and diffusion in those years. And it's very important to note how these economists were very happy to realize that they were able to implement their economic models, shape the behavior of citizens directly without any political impediment, thanks to the authoritarian government of Mussolini. So I look at the role of a man like Maffeo Pantaleoni, one of the founding fathers of pure economics, who sided with a man like Luigi Einaudi, who then became our first president of the Republic after the fall of fascism. Liberal and fascist economists participated in a common crusade to force citizens to accept lower reservation wages and fundamentally to consume less and produce more. So part of the analysis of the book is to show how this claim of economic objectivity, of expertise, of the science being above parts, was very, very powerful to provide the consensus for austerity. Austerity was about coercion through these economic policies implemented by the state, but it went hand in hand with consensus. I talk about this double strategy. The economic trinity of austerity needed backing, justification of high economic theory that justified these classist policies of shifting resources away from the people through a supposed unbiased scientific lens. So it is the Capital Order which exposes the big political role of economists in de-democratizing the economy, in keeping people away from economic decision-making, which is today we have kind of internalized as obvious. We don't get to discuss, I'm talking about the countries I know, of course, which are Italy, again, Great Britain and the United States. No one gets to discuss real economic issues. It is left to the expert. We take this for granted that the most important decisions of our societies are out of our hands. Well, this that we take for granted was actually constructed in a moment in which people were saying, no, we've sacrificed during the war, we died. Now we want to participate in economic decision-making. In a moment in which the Labour Party in Great Britain was calling to nationalize the Bank of England, in a moment in which self-management of industry and of fiscal policies was central to the public discussion. This is when economists, like in Great Britain, came up with the important crusade of the independent central bank. So we see how part of austerity is this technocratic imprint of keeping people away, constructing this very technical jargon of economics that very few can understand, which seems so unbiased, but clearly isn't, if you look at what was happening. Together with the insulation of economic decision-making through these new independent institutions. Independent central bank was the big message agenda of Ralph Hawtrey, who was one of the protagonists of this book. Ralph Hawtrey was the in-house economist at the British Treasury. And he said explicitly, the Bank of England should never explain, never regret, never apologize. These are actually his words. And he and his fellow experts at the British Treasury, who again are the characters of the story I tell, spread the word throughout the globe. So Basil Blackett went to India and forced an independent central bank in India in the 1930s. Otto Niemeyer went to Brazil and constructed an independent central bank in Brazil. Why? Well, the idea was that only independent central bank can be inflation averse. Something that, of course, is still what economists tell us right now. And it's the reason why the ECB is the most independent bank of all, is that there should be no political intrusion, because prudence can only come through experts that are willing to impose sacrifice on the population in order to stabilize the capitalist economy. So these parallelism between Great Britain and Italy showed that the de-democratization process of the economy happened through different nuances, but with a similar objective of subjugating the majority to the capital order. Now, the other reason why this parallelism is interesting is that it's not just two stories running side by side, but it's actually the story of how fascism strengthened its regime thanks to the international legitimacy it got because of austerity. So chapter 8, which is a chapter I'm very proud of because it's really a chapter that I constructed through only primary sources, digging through the archives. What you see is testimonies such as the one of Montagu Norman, head of the Bank of England in those years, who was writing to Jack Morgan of JP Morgan Chase in 1926. Jack Morgan was a big supporter of, the whole Wall Street was a big supporter of Mussolini in those years. But Montagu Norman, who is in a way the embodiment of liberalism, was noting how fascism, he says, even Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, who expressed wariness of the fact that under fascism, anything in the way of otherness was eliminated and opposition in any form was gone, added in the same breath, the state of affairs is suitable and at present and may provide for the moment the administration best adapted for Italy. He continued, fascism has surely brought order out of chaos over the last few years. Something of the kind was no doubt needed if the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the other direction. The Duce was the right man at a critical moment. This was written in 1926 after le leggi fascistissime were already passed and the regime was in full-blown authoritarian mode. So the capital order shows through archival sources how the international liberal elite applauded Mussolini for his capacity to impose austerity so efficiently. Mussolini laid off public employees, in the thousands, 60,000 in 1922, 3 as soon as he came to power. Regressive taxation was implemented. They cut inheritance tax and all capital levies and increased consumption taxes on the workers. They went back to the gold standard, increasing the interest rates. They privatized. The biggest privatization campaign happened between 1922 and 1925, the first years of Mussolini's government. They repressed wages by decree, so on and so forth. The typical austerity trinity template was put into action thanks to the experts that were advising Mussolini. Again, once more, the economists that are still today that have proposed the foundation of the neoclassical framework that still dominates today. And in this, of course, the liberal establishment, both within Italy and outside of Italy, was very, very happy and helped strengthen the regime. So to conclude, the capital order is an ambitious exercise because it goes beyond disciplinary boundaries. It's a work in the history of economic thought, reconstructing the type of economic ideas which backed austerity policies. But it's a work also in economic history, in which I show actual both quantitative and qualitative material. However, it's also work that tries to provide a theoretical present to understand a theoretical framework to understand the present. So chapter 10, the introduction and the last chapter encase the historical processes within more contemporary times. So chapter 10 shows how this use of austerity as a tool of reaction to disempower citizens when the capital order is being shaken recurs time and again in the history of capitalism and in the 20th as well as in the 21st century. So a big other moment was, of course, the 70s, in which again wage shares had gone up, workers had acquired a lot of rights in Italy and Britain, and there were big radical protests. In 1977 there was the important movement in Italy in which there was a large, widely spread sentiment that was mainly anti-capitalist about overcoming our current economic foundations for something different. It is in this moment that austerity strikes back again. And we know the going back, the creation of the Eurozone, and the euro functioned as a gold standard in the 1920s in naturalizing, depoliticizing austerity as the only way forward. And finally, even today, what we see is that clearly what is bugging the experts in power, what Jerome Powell and someone like Larry Summers see quite clearly, is that the capital order requires constant protection. So in the last year in the United States, we had 3% of the workforce leave their jobs altogether every single month. We had the phenomenon of the Great Resignation was massive. Anti-work movements are sprouting. Strikes in 21-22 went up 50% with respect to the previous years. There is labor turmoil. There's new unions emerging in the United States, especially in the retail sector. Amazon, Starbucks, you name it. And wages, nominal wages, have gone up. And this has been especially true for lower paid workers. So we are once again in a moment, and this is obvious also in Great Britain, in which the capital order is being questioned, of course, not as radically as it was after the First World War, because clearly austerity has succeeded in the last 100 years to disempower the workforce so that unionization rates are nowhere comparable with how they were after the First World War. So clearly, we are in a situation in which the workers have been weakened by austerity that lasted, I would claim, much longer than one thinks. Yet, we are in a moment in which wage relations are not really natural anymore. And this could be the effect of the pandemic, state interventionism during the pandemic. This said, what we see is that in the United States, in Great Britain, for example, the massive strikes triggered by inflation, this increased bargaining power of the working classes needs to be curtailed and quickly. And this is what is in the heads, and very explicitly so, of experts in power who say, well, we need to cool the economy. We need to fix this tight labor market. And how do we do this? Well, through austerity. Increases in interest rates will cool down the economy by increasing unemployment, which acts as a disciplinary mechanism on people. And of course, now we are in a phase of drastic cuts in social spending once more, quite all over the place. And I would claim that the attack on organized labor movements is everywhere to be seen. In the UK, just in the last couple of months, they passed 2 bills. One is called the Security Bill, which explicitly targets those who protest in the street. Similarly, the new government in Italy, Giorgia Meloni, came to power. The first thing she did, in great continuity with the Draghi government, has been a war against the poor, cutting away the income for reddito di cittadinanza, so the income you get for being a citizen, together with regressive taxes and passing laws to eliminate the criminalized protests as well. So this is the story that the capital order tells. And I think the idea is that if we look at the past, we can use greater critical lenses to question what is happening now that is proposed to us as the only necessary way forward. The technical, unproblematic economic agenda. Austerity is a word that is rarely used because now it's basically synonymous with prudent, realistic economic policy making altogether. But I would like, the book exposes the classist nature, the one-sided class warfare that is constantly being played to maintain the capital order and to maintain the status quo. I would say that we can finish here potentially.
Thanks so much. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that talk. So I imagine there are a few questions after such a provocative talk. Are there any economists who want to defend themselves? That would be fun.
Potentially, may I say something before we quit recording, so that this is for the sake of those who watch it after? I haven't really stressed the fact that part of how austerity is successful, right? Because the idea is austerity is not just irrationality, it's not pure madness as it's being disregarded by many Keynesians. There's method in the madness. And part of the reason why austerity is so successful, apart from the material condition in which it disempowers people, it also disempowers our minds in the sense that it really, what I would like to show is how the influence of economic model actually diffused throughout society. So we internalize a lot of the messages that come from the assumptions within the models of the neoclassical framework. This is another theme. So how, for example, we are ashamed of being poor, how we think if we're poor, it's probably because we're lazy and we deserve it. This comes out of a big shift in economic paradigm, which goes from class conflict to the centrality of the work, to a paradigm that's about harmony, individuals, and the saver entrepreneur as being the center of the economic machine. So you take away the worker, and you substitute it for the saver entrepreneur. And the saver entrepreneur now is the engine, the real engine. So of course it makes sense to do austerity, because austerity is all about incentivizing the virtuous few. So the shift of resources away from the people towards the saver investors is very much what austerity is about. And it's very much what we accept as being, of course, the correct policy, because ultimately we do think that those at the top are there because they are helping all of us, right? The conflict within capitalism is eliminated with the idea that actually there is such thing as the good of the whole within our society. And me coming from the New School tradition, we are one of the few places in the world in which we study classical political economy from the tradition of Marx, Ricardo, and Marx. And of course would tell you that capitalism as our socioeconomic system is not a system that is based on the gain of all, but it's based fundamentally on a trade-off, and there are always winners, few winners, and the majority who are losers. And this is where we can, if you like, stop recording for the questions.
Great, thanks, Clara.